It is Tuesday, the 9th of December, 2008. And Bonnie is here visiting for a few days. We've enjoyed having her here so much. And it really has made me feel enlivened to have her here.
10 years younger.
Yes, 10 years younger.
Okay, what I want you to do is to start at the beginning. I just read that you should ask someone about the day of their birth and let them tell the story, which basically is often myth, you know, the myth around the day that Jean was born. Because who knows the facts?
Yeah. Well, my father and my mother were married and about 2 years, I guess, when I was born. My father had suffered from tuberculosis when he was at West Point, and he was recovering in the mountain air in a little town near Wenatchee, Washington called Peshastin, where he was teaching. And he was coaching the football team there, and my mother was being a housewife, which was a new experience for her, I guess. And my grandmother and my grandfather moved to Yakima, so when school was out, my father and mother moved there too, to be with my grandparents. And I was born May 2nd, and
What year?
in 1919. And my father who had had a bad time with tuberculosis, contracted the I don't know whether it was the Asian flu or the Spanish flu after World War I. And my mother had it too, but my father didn't make it. I was only 4 months old when he died. And and my mother then stayed with my grandparents for a while. And my grandfather raised me when I was an infant until I was about 5 years old. He was sort of like a father to me. We moved to Seattle, and he used to walk me to school and come and get me home. And he was a wonderful man. He loved, of course, to garden and to work in the yard because he'd been a farmer, and they had a large farm in North Dakota with all the things that go with being a farmer. And so I can remember one time he took me for a walk to a little sort of some trees that were down by the road, and it must have been willow trees because he cut the branches and brought them home, and it was near Mother's Day, and he wove a beautiful little basket for my grandmother and lined it with moss and filled it with tansies and flowers and fixed it so that we could hang it up on the front porch. And I was so proud of that because I had a part of it. But when I was...
This is your mother's parents?
Yes, my mother's parents.
And what was her name?
That was Emily and David Carlson. They had been pioneers in North Dakota. In fact, they called their farm the Pioneer Farm. And the reason that my grandfather left the farm was that my grandmother had a fairly serious illness. Of course, she lived another 50 years, I guess, almost, after that. But no, not 50, more like 30. But then my mother my mother taught school. She'd been a 16-year-old school teacher in North Dakota, and when we came to when it came time for her to, she tried to be a secretary, but she couldn't stand being in that. She liked children, so she taught in little one-room schools out in the country, and that was. One year we were in the Methil Valley, I remember, which is a very beautiful valley in eastern Washington, and my mother rode horseback to go to school, and I was a healthy, vigorous 3-year-old that got into a lot of trouble, but I had a wonderful time living in a house that was half a log cabin and half a Victorian type house. Then we moved. Eventually, my mother went to school and got a teacher's certificate so that she could teach in more organized schools. She went up to Bellingham, and that's where she got her teaching certificate. And then after a certain length of time, she went to the University of Washington and got a life teaching certificate. Then she taught it. One year I remember she taught at PL, which was a coal mining town in western Washington. And everyone was Polish but Mother and me. And so the Poles were kind of snobbish, but I got along all right. Then we went to, eventually my mother went to teaching in Kennewick, Washington. She taught there for several years, and we lived with people called their name was Barry, and he is a dairyman, and he was the ice cream man in town, and his daughter Crystal and I were of an age, and we were very good friends for 2 or 3 years, 3 years I guess that Mother taught there. I started there in I guess the 2nd grade. No, it must have been the 3rd grade, because I skipped a grade when we were in PL, and so I must have been in the 3rd grade when we moved to Kennewick, and yeah, Mother was there for about 3 years too, and but she had ulcers, and in those days they didn't know any cure for ulcers, and so she would if she got upset, then her ulcers would act up, and we the Big Depression came along. There, you see, I was born in 1919, and in 1929 I was 10 years old, and the Depression was with us at least for almost 10 years. And Mother had to give up her school in Kennewick because we lived with my grandmother, and Mother was ill. She was a little thing. She was about 5'2", and it was hard for her to get up to 100 pounds. She was always losing weight, and so when she was very, very thin, my grandmother said, "You can't go back to teaching, Mabel." So Mother sold corsets door to door, which seems like a strange occupation, but spirella corsets, and I used to have that a corset and the instructions for she would fit them to people and sell them to them, and people wore corsets in those days, and with that you laced up the front and you laced up the back, and they were was in and the corset business was not very lucrative, but I went to, when we lived with my grandmother, she lived over near in Ballard in Washington, in Seattle, and so I went to Greenwood School through the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, I guess, and then went to my freshman year of high school at Ballard High School. And I was getting very, very well organized there and having a wonderful time. And then my mother got a school again, and it was out at a place called Silverdale at Clear Creek. It was out in the country, and it was another one-room schoolhouse. But it brought in $90 a month for 9 months. That was her first year that she taught out there. And she really put her foot down and insisted on more, and she got $100 a month for 12 months of the year. And we had a teacherage, which was next to the school, and there was an old abandoned church on the other side, and I went to high school, rode a bus every morning, and it was getting out there in the mornings. The meadowlarks would be just singing their hearts out, and there was always spiders with dew on the spider webs, and it was a really nice place to be. And I practiced tennis against the back of the church, and it was a pebbly court that I had, so the ball would bounce any which way, and I got pretty good at eye
Coordination.
yeah, competition. Anyway, I was pretty good there for a while playing tennis because of that practice I had. And I enjoyed my school. I finished high school at Silverdale. And,
Okay,
all right.
so you're in high school, playing tennis.
Oh, yes, I enjoyed high school and was and participated in a lot of things. And there. I
Okay.
can see better without my glasses.
Okay, okay, good.
All right, and when I graduated, they surprised me. I was the valedictorian, and I was really ashamed because I had played a great deal more than I had studied, and I thought, oh, this must not be a very good school if you could just play all the way through school and they come out valedictorian. But anyway, the valedictorians, the Washington State College in Pullman was giving, what do you call it?
Scholarships. No.
No, anyway, that they paid your tuition. No, yes, your tuition, and gave you a year's board, a room, not board. So and another girl, Katie Lork Knapp was her name, and she was, well, anyway, she and I were good friends. And we went to,
Keep talking.
oh, and we went to a community dormitory, and lo and behold, one of the people that started there was my cousin Beth, that I had been very good friends with. Well, and she and I would visit back and forth. She lived out at Tower Lake, and so Katie and Beth and I formed a giggling team, and we roomed. I've forgotten how it was, but we more or less roomed together, and we had a great. We all laughed all the time, of course, and they all made fun of me because they put me in genius English. Of course, I had wonderful English. I enjoyed English when I was in, and my grandmother had taught English to Swedish immigrants when she was 16 years old, and that was where she met my grandfather, because he came to this country. And she had perfect English, and my grandfather had a lovely little Swedish growl to his voice. And but my grandmother insisted on perfect English, and my mother did too. She taught, of course. So anyway, so I didn't have to go through the preliminary English, and that was fun, and I did pretty well. I was in the upper 1%, and they took your IQ, and so I came out very well in that. And believe me, I didn't have any chance to to gloat about it. They just wrote me something terrible about it, and so she.
So you're a freshman now in college.
Pardon?
You're a freshman now in college.
Yes, and I worked for a history professor who was very interested in India, and so I went over all the English magazines and cut out and registered all the stories about India. And of course, at that time, India was was colonized by the English. And I don't remember whether Gandhi was there yet or not, but it was early on.
Oh, yes.
And that was interesting to me. I went I went there 2 years, and I got fairly closely involved with a boy that was there. He was his name was Johnny Tweet, and he was I thought he was getting too serious, and Bethy was doing marvelously. Beth Neander, we both had the same last name, but Beth was a natural leader, and she was in Spurs, and she was in Mortarboard, and she was eventually she was whatever it was that they had the biggest big shot anyway, but I was getting a little tired of being Beth Neander's, lucky to be Beth Neander's cousin, and we spent a lot of time with her, and so I took that time out, and I got a job in the florist shop in Seattle. My aunt worked for Sullivan Florist, and he gave me a job at half-time, and so I studied at a business college. No, that was before that. At that time, wasn't working for him. But I went to a business college and learned shorthand and typing and general business practices. And I got a job with Prudential Insurance Company. I worked for a man who it was his job to try to get people to pay their insurance.
Premiums.
And he was a Mormon. So he really explained the Mormon church to me, and I really always have felt that I was pretty much an authority of the Mormon church because of his name was Joseph Smith or something. He was one of the Mormon big shots progeny. And anyway, but I was getting, was it $45 a month? It was not very much. It just barely paid my streetcar ride. I was staying with my aunt, with Uncle Ted and Aunt Irene, and riding the streetcar back and forth to work, and there wasn't much left after I guess I did pay her something a month for my board. And so eventually I gave that job up and went to school. Went to work for Mr. Sullivan half-time, and my Aunt Lillian worked there too. That was where I got to my job, and went to school at the university. And Irene was an AO Pi, so I pledged AO Pi, and I lived at the sorority house for a year or two, and it was right close to campus, so I'd wake up in the morning to the chimes on the they had a what do you call it? Yeah,
Caroline?
yeah, Carolyn, and I walked to school, and then I took the bus and I worked in the afternoons for 3 or 4 hours every afternoon, and I.
And what were you
there-
studying?
Pardon?
What were you studying?
Well, I had studied chemistry when I was at Washington State, but I had to give that up because you have laboratory classes, and if I was working 4 hours every afternoon, I couldn't get a lab in, so I just went to school in the morning, and I took the easiest course I knew, which was mathematics, and I did pretty well, but I had the head of the mathematics department taught anyway an advanced class, and I couldn't stay awake. It was just before noon, and I sit there and listen to that involved explanation of more dimensions than I believed were possible, trying to figure out. And he talked about eternity and infinity, and that's a part of mathematics, believe it or not. Anyway, I don't think I flunked anything. And then in summertime, I had a little Scotchman for a professor, and I loved his classes and his he had a Scotch accent, and I did very well in that, and that was what pulled me through. And and I took French as a minor, and I think I minored in philosophy or something. So I had a rather useless education, especially since now we have computers and you poke a button and the things that I'd had to fill the blackboard with to get from one place to another, you can do that right away on the computer. But it was, but I've always enjoyed mathematics and numbers, and I finally, at that time,
What year is it now?
now it was, well, I graduated from high school in 1936, and in 1941 I graduated from college, and when I was in 1939, Gus came out. Gus graduated from the university, or from the academy, the Naval Academy, and came to Seattle. He was interested in going to Alaska with President Roosevelt, he was on the Houston, and that was President Roosevelt's favorite yacht. And so he had planned to go to Alaska, and Gus was going to go with him as a young ensign. And then the war started in Poland, and Roosevelt had to cancel his summer trip. So Gus didn't get to ever go to Alaska, not with Houston, but Alaska was always sort of a beacon for him. He would like to have gone, and we became good friends.
How did you meet him?
My cousin Phyllis, who lost her older sister, and so she sort of adopted me as a younger sister, and we were fairly close, and her boyfriend Chet Ulan was he was he led hikes up to try to climb to the mountain, to the peak, the top of Mount Baker especially, and
Mount what?
Mount Baker.
Oh, Mount Baker. Okay.
Yeah. And he had been on a climb in Mount Baker, and they had an avalanche, and several people were lost, and so he was very late. He was going up to try to find those people, and Gus got interested in mountain climbing, so he came and wanted to go up the mountain, and so Chet took him on a hike, and they became very good friends, and so Phyllis and Chet decided that Gus and I should meet, and so we hiked. We met on a hike up to Lena Lake in the Olympics, and
Yes, we redid your hike.
pardon?
Doug and I redid your hike.
Oh yes. Well, that was. I guess you took pictures up there too.
We sure did.
Yeah, and I had pictures, of course, of that. And Gus, I guess we dated a couple of times, but he was on the Houston, and the Houston was sent to the Pacific. But he wrote letters, and he wrote voluminous letters he liked to write, and I'd, I was dating other people too.
So what did you think of Gus when you met him?
Well, I was I was interested. He was an interesting person. He had a lot to say about everything, and he wasn't. He wasn't. He was always very serious. He was not a fun-loving kind of person, and so I dated other people and had fun while he was gone. One of the things I did that I remembered long afterwards was that Aunt Lillian bought a house on Lake Washington, and so we used to go out there and I'd sleep on the porch, and the Sandpoint Naval Station was there, and the naval airmen would come by the house in the morning and roar their engines and wake people up, and then they would climb up and up and up and up, circling, and you'd hear the roar of their planes, and then all of a sudden the plane would cut off and they would turn over and come straight down at a target, I suppose. And then just before they hit the water, there was another great roar when they pulled back and didn't.
These were torpedo bombers.
They were torpedo bombers.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Those were the torpedo bombers that were lost at Midway. But I remember I really felt close to them because when they were lost. But anyway, and at that, then, well, this is a sort of a side story, but Mr. Sullivan decided to buy a house out on Bainbridge Island, and it was a very large, impressive house, and it had maybe 20 acres up the hill, and 600 feet of waterfront, and it was a cobblestone house, but it was a large, roomy house with anyway, Aunt Lillian, I think, put money into his purchase of that house in the end, and his wife had died before that, and so Aunt Lillian used to go out and cook and fix food for him for the week, and then she went back and worked, and he was retired and just took care of that house and all the extensive grounds, and he had a man that worked out there with him. He had the first station wagons were made of wood, and so he had a wooden station wagon. And I remember as it aged, that it started sprouting the little trees growing out of the top and the sides, and then that was it was a real live wood tree. He finally had to give it up, and then they had station wagons made out of steel instead of wood. But I thought that was kind of fun. And I used to spend a lot of time out at
So what year?
and let's see, that was when I was in high school, or when I was in college, and then when I finished, I graduated in 1941.
What's that?
Okay,
Yeah.
and I went to work for Mr. Sullivan full time, and And I dated,
And so what year was this? You went to work for him full-time?
well, let's see, I graduated in 1941. But before I graduated, all the fellows at the fraternities and so forth were going were being commissioned and leaving.
Back up. So what, no. Where your story was,
Oh,
because I missed just the end
yeah,
of it.
we got, we pretty much gotten up to 1941.
Uh-huh.
And I graduated in the spring of 1941 and went to work for Mr. Sullivan. And the boys that I was dating while I was in college were being commissioned and going to war. They were sent to Alaska and to various places. We weren't in war yet, but we were gearing up for war. One boy went up to Alaska, and he was feeling kind of blue about it, and he asked me to keep his fraternity pin for him. And I felt very guilty. He made it through the war, and he'd have liked to have his fraternity pin back again, but I didn't. I still have it, I think. But then Gus was on the Houston in the wars in the east or in the western Pacific. But there was the Japanese had an oil run from in Burma and so forth, and there was the Houston was sent to patrol that run, but Gus wore glasses at that time, and well, he always did, and the myth was that the Japanese did not respect people who wore glasses. You're supposed to be able to see, and so he was decommissioned from the Houston and sent to. It was sent back to the States, and he was sent to Newport News, Virginia, to put one of the early aircraft carriers into to commission that, and that was the Hornet. And so, and it was very sudden. He had gone for a hike in the Olympics, and something told him he'd better get back to. Let's see. When he left the Houston, he was on the Lexington, I guess. Yeah, but he'd better get back to the Lexington, and he did, and there was his orders were there to go to commission, and so he called me and told me that we would get married, and I would go back with him, and I didn't. I was sort of, that it was get married or lose it entirely. So we did, and I thought we'd just have a real quiet wedding and go. But he sent a trunk to I was staying with Aunt Irene and Uncle Ted, and he sent that trunk to Aunt Irene's house so I could pack up and be ready. And Aunt Irene said, "What is this?" And so then we had to admit we were going to be married, and it was to be with him 2 weeks, I guess. Well, Aunt Irene was not about to send me off. So, so she arranged quite an elaborate wedding at the place where she and Ted had been married, which is sort of a favorite. It was a well, anyway, it was one that it was a church that people that had money. Something is going.
Yeah, but that's,
What is it?
I don't know.
And so Gus was yeah, well, he was going to. He went along with it, and he got men in uniform to be his. Well, I guess Chet was his best man, and Phil would like to have been my matron of honor, I guess, but my cousin Bethy was available, and she and I had been so close, so she was my matron of honor. And I had been living at the sorority off and on, so we had the reception at the sorority afterwards. And there were several little romances, I think, that sprang up between my sorority sister and Gus's fellow officers on the Lexington, because even quite a bit later, one of the gals contacted me and wanted to know what had happened to somebody, but of course, Gus had moved on, and I didn't know anything about what happened. But
So were you married in a church?
yes, an Episcopal church, and it's up on the first hill in Seattle, and it's sort of a. There are a lot of people get married there. I don't know. Mr. Sullivan, of course, supplied all the flowers and all my family was there, and I have some pictures that were kind of precious to all of us. And I guess it was Uncle Ted or Uncle Al supplied the limousine that took us from and Mother insisted on getting me a trousseau. And my father, when he died, had bought some war bonds, World War I bonds, and in my name. Mother cashed those in and bought my trousseau, and she bought me a fur coat. It was I think it was, I don't know, it looked like cat skin or something. But it was very soft and very, very comfortable, very nice. I was glad I had it for a long time. And it was hard for Mom to see me go, I think.
What was your mom doing then?
Pardon?
What was she doing then?
She was teaching. She taught it out in the country in Silverdale for a long time, and then she moved into Silverdale proper and taught in that in a really organized school until she retired. And well, anyway, I left my family and went to cross country. I met Gus's family. His younger brother was married. And
Did any of them come to the wedding?
Pardon?
Did any of them come to the wedding?
Oh, no. We just stopped in Chicago, and they lived near Chicago, and his mother and dad had a farm, and they had a reception with all the cousins there, and all the all the German family, and his younger brother was married and had a little girl. They called her Gail Jean because Gus had written home about me, and so they named their daughter after me. And his younger sister was just getting ready to go to college. She was just graduating from high school. And he had an Aunt Marie who was there, and she sort of figured in our lives for a while. And Uncle Gus, who also was figured in our lives for a while. And his father, whom I just met a couple of times, he died, I guess in about 46 or so. And
What did Gus's dad die of? He wasn't very old.
well, he had been working he worked in the hot shop, I guess you'd say, for the railroad. For the Chicago-Milwaukee Railroad, and he was the one that stood in the pit and took the rails, beat the rails, the shoes off the wheels of I don't know, but it was hot and hard work, and he was in delicate health for quite a while before he died. And when he was sick for a while, Gus had to manage. His mother was not I guess she could write her name, but she had come to this country before she'd had any education to speak of. So she was a smart woman, but she didn't have any English to speak of, and couldn't manage so Gus had to manage it, and they were on welfare while his father was ill, and Gus never forgot it. He was always so careful with his money, and always buying the best bargain he could get, and he didn't have he didn't have a sense of how to spend money. He could make money, but he hung on to it, and now I'm glad because he insisted on buying all investing in municipal bonds, tax-free municipal bonds, and that kind of helpful. Anyway, but and then his younger brother Jim, let's see, yeah. And his wife Lou had a service station, and so
Bill.
he helped us find a
His brother
car.
Bill.
And we bought a car and drove from Chicago to Newport News,
Oh.
and that was kind of. Anyway, we got there, and Gus had never had a car, and I had learned to drive when I was 16 because my mother. Did I tell you about this?
Mm-hmm,
My mother, my grandmother bought a nice car, and my mother had to learn to drive it, and she was used to driving a horse. and, and, and Seattle is all uphill and downhill. And that was the days when you didn't have automatic shift on a car. And Mother had to learn to shift on a hill. And the darn instructor made her do parallel parking between two cars on a hill with that automatic shift. And she just fled, and so did I, because I was with her all the time. And then he had her up in the park, going backwards between, they had logs laid out for parking, and she had to back down one side and back down the other, and anyway, with all that instruction that she got, I learned to drive when I was 14. And so when I was 16 years old, on my 16th birthday, my Uncle Al took me down to the license bureau and bought me a license, and I drove the car. And so this business of having to give up a car because I'm 89 years old is very hard on me, because anyway, and I haven't had a serious accident in all those years. And I've driven across country any number of times, and I've, done a lot of taxiing, and so anyway, that well, we were in Newport News, and I was there when they commissioned the Hornet. I was there, and the Admiral was there, and the captain, of course, and not everybody was in uniform, and it was really an impressive ceremony. And I guess it was Gus's roommate's girlfriend came to visit him before, and so she stayed with us. And they decided to get married. So really, Gus and I had to sort of be Papa and Mama to her.
Wait, who is this?
Well, her name was Isabel Varley, and she married Gus's roommate.
Oh, it's roommate.
And so we stood up with them, and they came to our house. We had a two-bedroom apartment. So then they stayed with us until December 7th. And the boys were gone quite a bit because they were doing trial runs with the ship and so forth. But I think they were in port, and they were in port on December 7th, and the day that would live in infamy, and they were called back to the ship right away, and I don't know what they did, but
Wait. Were you with Gus when he heard about it?
Yeah, I think so. I think we heard about it over the radio, and then right away they were called, back to the ship. And but the ship was still being commissioned, and it was I guess it was the spring, almost the spring of the year before they were ready to move, and they were sent to the through the canal and to the Pacific coast, and then they were going to be in San Diego, I guess it was. So Izzy and I drove across country in our car to San Diego, it was an interesting drive because the Old South was the Old South, and we drove all through the South, and then through Texas. Took a long time to get through Texas, and then we went to, and somehow we made contact with them. I've forgotten. Oh, I guess we decided on a hotel where we would stay. And when the ship came in, we were not there very long before the ship came in, and they called us. And we had a few days in San Diego, and then we went up to San Francisco. And we stayed, Izzy and I stayed in the top of the Mark Hopkins. Anyway, the Mark Hotel, I remember. And we used to go to the top of the Mark, and from there you could see all over the bay and see the Golden Gate Bridge. And the fellows would come and stay sometimes at night, and then we'd take them back. And I remember taking Gus back to the ship one morning, and they were loading Army planes onto this. And Gus turned to me and he said, "Don't you ever say anything about this, what's going on here. And, keep quiet about it." And I think that was it. I don't remember I don't think he got back to come back to. And then Izzy and I sat up at the top of the Mark and saw the ship go through the Golden Gate and go out the Pacific. And Izzy stayed there. She was pregnant. And I drove up the coast to Seattle. And I remember the only thing I had to eat was oranges. I bought a big box of oranges, and I don't remember if I stayed overnight or whether I think I just drove straight on up. I was orange myself by the time I got there. and it was then Gus and I had little secret codes, and rewrote, of course, frequently. And when they went, he went out to sea, and I went to work for Mr. Sullivan again. Yeah, I think I went back to work there. And when their first big battle was the Battle of Midway. That was when the Japanese were going to take over the island of Midway, and they made a big mistake. They sent part of their fleet up to the Alaskan Aleutians, and anyway, that was when the so many airmen were lost, but they did sink several of their Japanese ships, and they lost an awful lot of airmen because we did, and the Japanese did too, but their aircraft carriers were sunk or disabled, so they couldn't take their planes back. The guys get up there in the air and fly around until there was no place to go. And they just had to ditch their planes.
Now, why don't you, there's 2 minutes left, but you can do it. Explain what it was about the Army planes going on, just briefly.
Yes, that's right. The Army planes, before the Battle of Midway, the Hornet went over to Japan, launched these Army planes, and they flew over Japan and dropped bombs and then they had to fly on to China. And some of them made it and some of them didn't, because they had to start pretty far out at sea because they ran into some Japanese fishing boats, and they were afraid that they would alert the Japanese that there was, and so they had to fly further than they had planned. And then they came back, and of course that was their big adventure until the Battle of Midway. And the Hornets survived the Battle of Midway, but they lost an awful lot of men. Those dive bombers I was talking about were almost all shot down, or well shot down, and then they had some torpedo bombers that came in toward the ship and released their torpedoes, and they were all lost. And their torpedoes were made by some company that in Connecticut, and I guess they weren't very good torpedoes anyway. They didn't go off. So that it wasn't the glorious adventure.